To reintroduce Bill Maurer, that Bill is a cultural anthropologist from University of California at Irvine. That one of the exciting things about working in this area has been the breadth of academic areas and expertise that tie together. That I've been fascinated just learning things about social science and have gained a lot of respect for a set of ethnographers I've worked with. So very excited when the opportunity came to invite Bill to give a talk to us, since he's been working with money, studying it deeply, getting an understanding of both physical as well as virtual money. And so I will let him take over and give his reflections.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking Richard and Jen for having me up here, and I also want to thank all of you for sticking with today. There's been a bunch of great conversations and presentations, and I hope we have time at the reception to carry them on. I also want to thank and acknowledge the group of folks yesterday who played our Rosca game. It was totally great and a lot of fun, and we got a lot of really interesting insight from the way that you all played it. And I do want to acknowledge also Jenny Fan, seated there in the corner, who has also come up from UCI, who's been the administrator for the Institute for Money Technology and Financial Inclusion, which I direct at UC Irvine for the past 10 years or so. And IMTFI was funded by the Gates Foundation for about 8 or 9 years. We're now transitioning to other funding and doing some other kinds of work, but we basically have built up a really rich archive of material on the sort of user side of mobile money services, but also other forms of new technology around money, from ATMs to, actually, I have to say it, like to cash itself, because some of the projects that we funded looked at recently sedentarized people who were only beginning to start to use physical instantiations of currency. And we've looked at that interface between all of the different technologies and tools of money in a range of contexts and countries. Our model, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, was basically every year to do a kind of star search to find researchers around the world based in the countries where new technologies were being deployed, solicit their ideas for the kind of projects that would be important, and then grow and nurture this community of researchers around the world. We grew a network of over 180 researchers working in 48 different countries, and we're still doing work to maintain and kind of work with that group. We took our kind of last bits of money from Gates and actually fed it out to 3 regional centers, which are now established. One in Pakistan at Habib University, one at CIESAS Guadalajara in Mexico, and one in Senegal at CODRACIA, which is the African Social Science Association, so that the kind of model of ethnographically focused in-depth research on the user side of money and its technologies would kind of carry on in new forms. So I steal my title from a synthetic paper that we just put out, which I think you might have copies of up here, maybe you don't. But yeah, we have some IMTFI collateral at the top if people are interested. That was done by a couple of my postdocs, Taylor Nelms and Stevie Ray, and they titled their thing "Mind Your P's and T's," something, 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 something. And I just stole the beginning of it because I like it, and I get to because I'm the director. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to review for everyone here the mobile money story. Most of it you'll probably know. I may be filling in some blanks for some folks, just to talk about kind of where it all came from and the kind of shift in practice, and also the conceptual shift from thinking about mobile money primarily as a peer-to-peer transfer system to thinking about it more broadly as a payments platform, and what it meant to start thinking about it in terms of payments. I'm going to obviously be talking a lot about how culture matters and continues to matter, and matters in different ways in different places all the time, thus the need for kind of ongoing research into what people actually do with these systems when they're set out there in the world. And I'm going to focus on those P's and those T's. The kind of peers involved, who often are not just the peers that we think of, as in I'm sending money to Jen, but the peers who are also intermediaries in the network who help facilitate those transactions. And then also I'm going to say a little bit about the infrastructures, both the those social infrastructures that those intermediaries make up, but also the technological infrastructures and ways that we think about them. I warn you in advance, I'm going to be sort of telescoping in and out between micro-level interactions, like people doing things that they do, to kind of macro level social, economic, and political processes that I think it's important to bear in mind when we're thinking about these sorts of systems. And then because I was asked, I'm going to do a little interlude on China, just because, and talk a little bit about some work on Wechat Pay that we did earlier this academic year. I'm going to conclude on some sort of lessons learned, and then point to some future directions for research. So the mobile money story. Most of you are familiar by now with the way that kind of mobile money emerged, very much from the bottom. Jan Chipchase, an ethnographer from Nokia, as well as some other anthropologists and telcos in parts of Uganda, primarily Uganda initially, were noticing that people were buying airtime and never using it, right? Or someone would buy a top-up card like this, scratch off the thing, get the secret code, and what did they do with it? They texted the secret code to a friend somewhere else as a means of payment, who would then text the code to someone else, who would then text the code to someone else, who eventually might use it or might go back to the kiosk and informally sell it back to the guy at the kiosk who would take a cut. I interviewed, in my own work, I've done a lot of interviews with people involved in the development of new payment systems. So, I interview the, like us, right? And also the us in industry who make these things. And in one of those interviews early on, in describing to me how they were starting to see this sort of thing pop up, and the guy I was talking to worked for a sort of white label airtime distributor, right? So the airtime distributor that sits behind the telco here, he said, we realized what they were doing, and on that special day, money magically appeared out of the woodwork, right? And he went on to say that we realized that we were not an airtime company, we were a money transit company. And in saying that, he basically echoed, if those of you are familiar with the history of payments, he echoed Dee Hock's famous statement, the guy who founded the interbank network that became Visa. He said, we realized one day we weren't in the business of providing credit, we were in the business of the exchange of electronic value. So this sort of realization hit folks like my informant here, and then opened up the whole industry. IMTFI was founded in 2008. So in 2008 is a sort of magical year. Like we get sort of 07, 08, we get M-Pesa, and we get the iPhone, and we get the global financial crisis. And all of these things actually do become relevant later, especially as I'll talk about in a minute. We see this vast explosion in the domain of payments, not just with M-Pesa, but more broadly. As I said, we started researching what was happening on the ground to try to get that sort of end user perspective, because there was frankly a lot of BS that was being circulated about what was happening on the ground. And one of my favorite bits of BS has to do with the way that this story kind of circulated, coming from the ad campaign. Some of you are familiar with this billboard that, there's the guy in the city and he's sending money home to mom, and look how happy she is. And isn't it a great way to sort of support the family? And we always used to joke, those of us with more of this kind of ethnographic perspective, yeah, what's going on is dad, I don't have the thing. Dad is like passed away, right? So he's sending money to mom for like the funeral expenses. And for us, that became a story that really signified the rapidity with which M-Pesa and also other services like it didn't come in and supplant existing practices or change them, but got slotted right into them, right into the incredibly rich social world of obligations that you see manifested in a funeral payment. You know that M-Pesa went on to incredible success, but with some of my colleagues then at the Gates Foundation, Jake, who was here earlier, and also some of the researchers that we had supported, we started sort of wondering what it was that we were really seeing. And we wrote this article that was published in MIT Innovations, basically kind of making the case that what we were seeing was a payment system, not just a money transfer system, and certainly not mobile banking or mobile savings. And again, for context, when I got into this, the whole thing was, this is mobile savings, or this is M-banking. And more we're like, oh, no, this is more like the Visa network. And then we have to think about payment infrastructures and what they are and what they mean. And just for a little crash course in payments, because payments is a sort of sleepy area, or at least had been a sleepy area before 2008. In the US anyway, we basically have 5 core payment systems. There they are. We don't think about them, but they're each relatively independent infrastructures that facilitate the transit of value. This is part of the two, right, in P2P. This is the sort of hidden infrastructure. There's the credit and debit rails. There's the bank-to-bank wholesale clearance network, the ACH, the automated clearinghouse. That's the thing if you're direct bill paying your mortgage or getting direct deposit for your paycheck, that's happening. If you have PayPal connected to your bank account and not your credit card, it's basically riding the rails of the ACH. There are the wire services like Western Union. Those have a fascinating history that I alluded to earlier. Think about American Express and the colonization of the American West. The checking system, which again is kind of semi-autonomous from the others, and cash, which we don't think of as an infrastructure, but it is. And of these, one of them is truly public, and 2 of them are federally mandated, at least in this country. The truly public one is cash, and I think that's going to become important in what I'm going to say later on. The federally mandated ones are the checking system and the ACH. The only ones that settle at par, which means I give you $10, you get $10, are technically the ACH, the checking system, and cash. Right? Now, there can now be fees for some of these things, but not cash. Par settlement, I think, is something that it's very important to think about. There are really significant consumer protection issues around what happens when we have a private payment system that doesn't settle at par. In this country, it was an enormous political battle to get par settlement of checks. It was one of the first things the Federal Reserve did. Par clearance did not happen in the states of the former Confederacy. And you can probably fill in all the blanks there. And if you can't, we can talk about it later. The last talk I gave was about race and payments, so that'll give you a clue. And another thing to bear in mind here is that as I said, payments had been relatively sleepy before 2007, 2008, and there really hadn't been much action. Those main core systems kind of got established, some of them quite old, some of them in mid-century in the 20th century, and then nothing really happened. So first, I think we have to realize when we want rapid change, we're going to make this thing and we're going to deploy it, it's going to change everything. It took forever for people to adopt credit cards. Okay? It took 20 or 30 years for all the things that you need to have just behaviorally for folks to accept this. This is an early Bank AmeriCard magazine ad campaign to get people to think of it as money, right? Now it's not at all anything for us to think about paying with plastic. This was a huge deal. There were amazing ad campaigns specifically geared toward working women to get them to have the freedom and independence of having a credit card. And they're all you can see them all on YouTube. They all basically have the same plot line where single woman alone, usually at night, or it's raining, coming home from work, something happens, she gets a flat tire, she doesn't have any cash, ta-da, she's got the Bank AmeriCard thing ready to go, and so she has freedom and independence. But this was a remarkable achievement, right? This was a remarkable kind of socio-technical achievement to get people to think of that as money. Now, as I said, it had been kind of sleepy and there was not much action. But then, boom, this 2007-08 thing, and we had what my colleagues Taylor Nelms and Lana Swartz and I have called the Cambrian explosion in payments. The Cambrian explosion, right? Remember your evolutionary biology. It's the period on the planet Earth when all of a sudden there was this huge profusion of different body plans. Right now, we only have a handful, right? We have things with radial symmetry like starfish that have 5s. We have all of our insects and stuff that are basically 6'9" or like millipedes. We have most chordates that have bilateral symmetry. That's kind of it. During the Cambrian period, there were all kinds of crazy creatures roaming the Earth. So we talk about what we're living through now as a kind of Cambrian explosion, where folks have been experimenting with all kinds of different aspects of functionalities of mobile devices in particular to make payment happen. So you've got Level Up there on the upper left, which has anyone ever used? Level Up? Really? On purpose or just to try it out? Just try it out, yeah. And it's, it has its own little scanner thingy, and then it makes a little thing. And I always think it's funny because I never quite got why it's called level up. Like, I think you do earn some sort of points or whatever, but to me it's like level up because you have to level the thing up just right to make it read. I can't tell what's in the middle. There's Apple Pay, which is hilarious for various reasons. Currency, which doesn't exist anymore, which was a merchant-driven thing that gave you QR codes to then get you deals when you paid at merchants. I have Point there. I loved Coin. Did anyone ever know Coin? This is like before there was like Bitcoin. It was just Coin. I loved it. I have one. And it has like a kind of rewritable mag stripe, and it has a little rewritable like RFID wire, and you would push this little button, and this would change, and it would give you like Visa, and then it would become your Visa card, and it was like Bluetooth to your phone. It was kind of fabulous, but it died. And as I said, what these things were all doing is exploiting all the different data channels that the mobile afforded. And clearly, as I said in my story about the kind of importance of 2008, it's the iPhone that occupied so much mind share at that time, right when it came out. And even at the Federal Reserve's first convening on mobile payment, even though everybody was talking about M-Pesa, everybody was also talking about the iPhone, right? And what is it going to do, and how are we going to use it, and how can it do all kinds of things. I also always loved this, the Samsung Pay magstripe emulation, right? Has anyone ever, because it's kind of hilarious. Like my phone will like generate little pulses that a magstripe reader will read as if I'm swiping a card through it. Anyway, and we've had this flurry of activities and companies going on. And so the next thing to ask is sort of, what's going on? Why are people so captivated by payments in this period? There's one story about the iPhone. There is another story about M-Pesa. M-Pesa happened, and people were like, wow, like, why can't we do that? Someone earlier said we're so behind here, right? And we were, and why? And how can we kind of make mobile payment happen? The other thing that is very, very, very important to bear in mind is that there was this dream, and there still is this dream of cashlessness, which is a very old dream. This is the promotional flyer for The Man from Diners Club, a 1963 Danny Kaye movie. It's really bad, but it's worth seeing if you're involved in payments. You can imagine sort of what happens. It's about the Diners Club card, and also like the computer coming and changing everything, changing business and blah, blah, blah. You kind of know what's going to happen, right? Like the computer breaks, the cards go everywhere. Danny meets the woman, hilarity ensues, they hate each other, they fall in love, the end. But it's this sort of amazing story that was used by the Diners Club to help generalize this idea of a non-cash form of payment. And why a non-cash form of payment? In the 50s and 60s, when Diners Club was coming into being, it was very much because the Fed had just eliminated non-par clearance of checks, right? And so there was a federally mandated kind of thing that cut into the business of those who deal with payment. So we need to have a new business. Another kind of thing bound up with the Diners Club in particular was the interstate highway system. Right now there were these freeways that connected people. People needed a way to pay when they were far away from their banks. There were traveling salesmen, et cetera, et cetera. Diners Club. The other thing going on here, and I think I have another promo. Yeah, there's this, there he is with the newspaper headline in the movie, Cash Died Today. The other thing going on, though, back then, but especially in around the time of the financial crisis, was the search for new revenue streams. And this quote is from a mobile money professional in around 2010 who told me, yeah, basically what we want to do is we want to get people to get their cash in, and we want to keep the money in the system forever, right? Why do we want to keep the money in the system forever? Any answers? And I'm sorry, like, so I'm being a little bit heretical, okay? Why? The financial crisis has happened. How?
Keep the costs really low, so they can charge, and hence the ROI is much higher.
To charge what?
Transaction fees.
You got it. So, right, we had this whole shift in payments and banking from revenue based on the traditional way that banking works, which is you give me your money and then I lend it out to other people and I charge them interest and I make money. Right? That's sort of not working anymore. So I'm going to go toward a fee-based revenue model. This is a drawing by Mark Twain in his book Roughing It, which is his account of living in the Nevada Territory when his brother, Orion Clemens, was the governor of the Nevada Territory. And he has this really funny part where he talks about the silver mines, right? The Comstock lode happens, and all of a sudden it's all about silver, 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 silver. But he says, really what was happening was it wasn't so much the silver, it was the freighting business. And everyone was angling to build new toll roads. There was nearly as much excitement over suddenly acquired toll road fortunes as all the wonderful silver mines. And what we see post-2008 in this Cambrian explosion in payments is really this attempt to create more toll roads for your money, more toll roads for the transit of value. And his thing is great because all the roads kind of go to nowhere, you see. They spill off the map and they don't really go anywhere. Okay, let me shift gears. That's sort of my macro picture, just for a little bit of cynicism about some of this stuff. The thing is, so you might think, okay, so what? That's a nice story about the way that payments articulates to broader economic and political forces in the US and in the world. We can then think about sort of the great game that's been taking place in Africa as different services vie for kind of domination as that continent gets wired in various ways for digital payment platforms. With IMTFI, though, we were always also sort of saying, okay, that's all happening, but these things are going out there in the world and people are doing things with them. And people are not always doing the things with them that they necessarily are telling researchers who arrive for 2 weeks with a survey. So as I said, we worked with local researchers, people who could gain access to scenes and situations that I, for instance, would probably never have access to. And they would kind of come every year to UC Irvine to talk about their work in progress and present to us all, each other, things like this. Okay, where's the dude? Here's where the video will not work. Ready? Okay. This is a soothsayer in northern Ghana with this sort of stick device he's got that he just banged, calling down the dead, calling down the ancestors for a conversation about mobile phones. And there's this other guy with him. In a second, the researcher is going to come on another video and explain what you're seeing, but just take a look. Oh, I didn't want that to happen. Okay, that's fine. Totally fine. You get the idea. Wait, how can I? Oh, there he is. Okay.
The divination process then is a process where the client head uses that to ask questions to the ancestor, gets the answers, and then pass them to us. But he didn't go on his own. We asked him to kindly ask his ancestor about certain questions. And we asked about the use of mobile phones for texting, making calls, browsing, and other things. And then we also ask, you can see that the money is passing through the mobile phone to someone. Whether he thinks that we can pass through, we can use the mobile phone to channel money to someone. And then somebody asked, my brother here asked whether the soothsayers might accept payment of their consultation fee using mobile money. But it appears that they said no. The oracle wants to touch and feel the consultation fee. So we have to pay cash and get a receipt for it.
I love it. Did you get all of that? So there's a couple. The punchline, right, is that the oracle basically says, you can use mobile money for this, that, and the other, but not for me. For me, I have to touch and feel the money. for the consultation fee. You're going to give it to me. And then he says, then we had to give him cash and give him a receipt and get a receipt for it, which then he submits to Jenny to like get reimbursed by IMTFI basically. So I mean, I love this story, right? This is the kind of thing that is virtually inaccessible, that brings to light how people are integrating mobile money into daily practice that matters to them, into ritual practice and religious practice that also involves, kinship, not just with the dead, obviously, but with the living. Another thing that you may have missed is there's like 3 or 4 intermediaries involved, right? They go to a guy and talk to the guy who goes in to the oracle, right? That's the guy we saw seated, who then talks to the oracle, who's talking to the dead person, right? So many of these intermediaries, and I, can't help but thinking, like, are those things that we necessarily want to replace, or are those things that it's even possible to replace, given the other functions that that these people, living and dead, have in this kind of social world? There. So that leads me to ask questions about intermediaries and infrastructures, and to think about, we always talk about, will people trust the service? And we think of trust in this sort of abstract sense. And we've got a thing up here you can take away on trust and money that we put together, culling some insights from some of the work that we had done, which really drives home the point that trust isn't one thing. Trust isn't just between me and you, or me and some abstract service like, M-Pesa or my Visa card. We have to think about the actual use cases, including the cases where they fail, where they don't work. For me, if my Visa card doesn't work, what do I do, right? It depends. It really depends. If I'm at home, whatever, right? If I'm at home, whatever, and then if I get a text from my bank saying something weird happened, then that's fine. If I'm away, right, what am I going to do? I'm stuck. So actual use cases matter. And they differ, and trust changes based on those use cases. We have to think about actual intermediaries. We had some examples of those throughout the day, but I really love this one because those intermediaries can be living and dead. And we also need to think about infrastructures, infrastructures that work and hopefully work reliably. That oracle's stick that he uses to call down the dead works reliably. If your mobile money service doesn't work as reliably as that guy's stick, you have a problem, right? We have to remember that these are often contexts where people are used to infrastructures and institutions failing. I've mentioned this anecdote to some people here already, but at the very first conference that we had at UC Irvine, where we brought together the researchers, one of our researchers asked if anyone in the audience had ever lost money because of a bank failure. And almost every single one of the researchers we had funded put their hand up, right? And these are people doing research on kind of money technology and trust and whatever. And yeah, so there's also stuff that you're just not going to get from a survey. And this is a story that I hope I can sort of tell quickly and get right, because this is one that I think really helped people besides us see that there was value in doing this kind of in-depth ethnographic work. This is from research by Sibel Kusimba. All of this is posted on the IMTFI website. All of our stuff is there. There's a whole wealth of information there if you want it. And this poor young man is having his circumcision ritual in northeastern Kenya. And one of the things that goes on during this is the presentation of the 13th cow. Okay, there is not actually a cow in this picture because the 13th cow can also be some goats. We have goats instead of a cow. What the 13th cow is basically at the marriage of a man and a woman, there's a bride wealth payment that's paid. That's 12 cows, right? And it doesn't have to be cows, but denominated in units of cattle. So, think about units of denomination that people actually use, not units of denomination that we think people ought to use, like denominating in, Kenyan shillings or whatever. So this payment is made. And then 12, 13 years later, at this ritual, a 13th cow is returned, right? Given back to the family of the crap. I think it's the groom. Anyway, is returned. And the boy is initiated into manhood, blah, 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 blah. And then it all depends what happens to that cow or these goats next. Some of them might be slaughtered and you have a big feast, or more often they're just sort of bought and then sold back. There's these great, of course, markups that happen around the time when people are going to be buying their goats or cows for their 13th cow thing. And one of the ways that people are paying for these animals is by sending money to relatives in the village here, sending little bits of money through M-Pesa at a regular interval to accumulate the funds to buy these beasts, right? Okay. At one of our IMTFI conferences, we always had a public workshop and then a closed-door workshop just for the researchers. And it came up in the closed-door workshop, this, that, and the other, and how people were using M-Pesa, and somebody said, what everybody here knows people use M-Pesa for, school fees. And somebody else said, I'm so sick and tired of hearing about the school fee thing. They're using it to pay for circumcision rituals for the 13th cow, right? They're using it for that. Okay, you don't get that from a survey, but here's the next interesting thing. When they sell these animals back, if they're not going to slaughter them, so you just buy it for the thing and then you sell it back, then you have a little bit of money, right? What do you do with that money? Pay your school fees. So, the survey response is correct in a sense, but what are you missing? And you're not just missing, oh, this is a colorful ritual, right? You're missing the settling of a 12 or 13-year-old debt, right? You're missing a long-term credit and debt relationship that stretches over this huge expanse of time for these people who are, calculating and in all sorts of ways, not just with their money, but with their relationships. I put down the thing. Oh, here it is. Okay, that's my 13th cow. Interlude, China. So folks are probably looking at Wechat Pay and Alipay. I just want to say a few words about it. I've written about some of this on the IMTFI blog. For me, it's really interesting to think about these services in terms of where they came from. And this gets to some of the path dependencies sort of things that I was talking about earlier on the panel. We've got two companies from which these things spring. And it makes a difference that those were different kinds of companies. Tencent was a gaming company. Alibaba Group was basically a kind of eBay shopping portal. And depending on where you start, determines a little bit where you go. So Tencent and Wechat Pay kept with its kind of gamification of things. And many of you may know that one of the ways that it became so popular early on was by using the Chinese Lunar New Year ritual of exchanging red envelopes with little bits of money in them. So they just kind of appified the red envelope and let you send gifts of money in a red envelope at Lunar New Year, right? Cultural practice that everyone knows. It's totally fun. It's totally gamified. Bam, right? And it worked. In the very first set of design principles that IMTFI put out there in the world about, so you want your mobile money service to go, we actually used the red envelope example and said, how about this? Put a little wrapper on it and attach it to a holiday. Anyhow, on the tech side, one thing interesting about both of these services for this group is that they're using a QR code and the screen and interface and also NFC, not USSD or SMS. So I don't actually know where this stands today, but there had been in sort of last summer, August, September, October, kind of concern among the Chinese telcos that they were being shut out of the whole thing because none of it was riding their rails. It was all going through the data services side of things. I have no idea how that's been resolved or who resolved it. Another thing you're probably aware of is that there's been a lot of effort with these payment services to use biometrics. And this gets to a next thing that's important for us to think about. I mentioned earlier that the name of the game in payments after 2008 became basically rent-seeking, like tolls and fees. This is changing that. This kind of thing is changing that game a little bit, not just in China, but here, and making the name of the game data, 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 data. The company that I did not name in the very beginning, that white label airtime company, the guy who said on that day we realized money magically appeared. In subsequent conversations, a year or so later, he and his colleagues were like, yeah, not only did we realize that we're a payment rail, but we're also sitting on gobs of data about people. And I'm like, what are you going to do with that data, right? Thinking they're going to give me some machine learning answer. And they're like, oh, we don't know. We just want to get bought by Google. But this is a thing, right? And this is now kind of leading people to think about what you can do with this kind of data in the digital financial services space. I'll come back to that near the end of this talk. So some lessons learned. One of the first lessons learned, and again, I'm going to be heretical, is careful what you wish for, or Modi's going to demonetize the high denomination banknotes, right? We had researchers there documenting the effects of this, looking at what was going on the ground, and the incredible, painful disruption that this caused to an awful lot of people. We have been thinking a lot about the unintended consequences of cashlessness, both because empirically what we see is that no payment system ever replaces another. Okay? Like, you probably have a coin somewhere, if not on your person, then like in the cup holder of your car. Coins were invented in like 600 BC, okay? Paper money, right? I could go on and on and on. I have in my wallet virtually everything that one could have to pay with, except I don't have a coin right now in my pocket. And often the stuff gets framed in terms of cashlessness or a war on cash. That, first of all, empirically isn't just going to come to pass. There won't be cashlessness, I'm sorry. In this country, 25 to 33% of people are un- and underbanked and are shut out if they don't have access to cash. And also the sort of war on cash thing, not just since the recent presidential election, but before, was really feeding a lot of kind of anti-government and populist feeling. There is this, we have to just sort of state it, I think, as we forget sometimes when we're kind of building tech and it's all going to be happy, that there's a big, great game going on among payment providers, the legacy systems and the new systems. The data thing and this great game makes me wonder how digital denominations are going to be issued, who's going to issue them, who's going to manage them, who's going to track them. A lot of the stuff that I see in the cryptocurrency space around creating, Bitcoin wallets or whatever, my colleagues and I have said for a couple of years now that we don't think that's actually going to be about crypto. It's going to be about the first nation state that issues some kind of digital denomination and needs a user interface for people to be able to pay that way. And you can easily imagine a nation state issuing a fiat cryptocurrency that would be like a low denomination, right? A low value, low denomination, digital only thing for micropayments or whatever. Partly just to be cool, but that might be a thing. But then who's going to issue it? Who's going to manage it? Who's going to track it? And I'm afraid to touch an extra button here, even though I want the little pointer. Which one? That one? Oh, there we go. And then this question is lurking all the time too. That so much of what we're talking about is the development of private infrastructures, not public ones, and often private infrastructures to take the place of public ones. It's kind of ironic to me, since going back to the very beginning of mobile money, it was initially envisioned in part as a way to facilitate the collection of taxes by public authorities in developing world countries, right? It was initially supposed to kind of help the public sector, but became a game of private providers modulo the monopoly point that was made earlier. Okay, so some future directions. These are things that are kind of on the research agenda for the community of scholars that I interact with, mostly in kind of anthropology and sociology of fintech. We exist. We're not huge, but we exist, and we've been doing a lot of work in this space for a while, and here's what the sort of things that we're thinking about. This is, some of you may have seen this picture in the I think it was in the Washington Post, of a guy in China begging with a QR code, right? So you can pay with Wechat Pay. On the agenda for us is thinking about this whole question of the extent to which new digital services create payment deserts, create spaces where it's difficult for some people to pay, period. So then, where can't we pay? Who can't pay? In Sweden, it's really hard for me to pay because it just is. Now it's a lot easier. Now I have a chip card, but when I didn't, it was like virtually impossible. There are no ATMs. Nothing takes cash, right? It's this building, and on the ground floor, I don't know what it is, but there's something that is for students, and there's a big sign there on the flip side that says cash or checks only. So if you only have your credit card, whatever that thing is down there, it's some sort of like lab or facility. Anyway, we saw it yesterday. I should have taken a picture of it. But there's kind of a variegated geography of payment. One of the projects that we did is we drew a kind of golden spiral on a giant map of LA, and then sent people walking / driving all along it. It was just sort of a random, let's put a thing on LA and to give us a pathway to follow. Followed the path, and every so often did a census of the ways that you could pay. And this is Los Angeles. Absolutely eye-opening and astounding to see, where it was cash only, where it was no cash, where it was cash only but no denominations higher than 20, or cash only but nothing over 20 after 10 p.m., or must use Square, right? All that kind of stuff. LA, granted, is a very complicated, involuted geography, but it was instructive that in a place that is, this major urban megalopolis in North America, there were payment deserts, and it was segmenting people based on all the characteristics that you can imagine and fill in the blank, including how you're able to pay. So what are the consequences of cashlessness? Who's left out of credit as new forms of credit are deployed based on the technologies of cashlessness? And I'm not just thinking about the China social credit scheme, but all of us as algorithmic decisions are determining who has access to what forms of credit that might be based on things like payment data instead of the traditional lending data. Is it a game or is it virtual shopping? I mean, this obviously connects up to what we learned from China, but I think it matters. It was Patrick earlier who talked about seatbelts, and seatbelts made me think, as sort of one kind of basically consumer protection kind of thing. I started imagining not just seatbelts but speed bumps, right? As we move more and more toward ambient gamified payment, do we need to have speed bumps along the way to remind us you're losing money right now? Payment money is leaving your account, even if you don't know it or don't feel it. And I think that with some of there's a couple things going on at the same time, right? There's sort of gamification of payment. There's also the development of ambient payment. Ambient payment is where I just walk around and money leaves me. So if you Lyft or Uber, that's happening, right? But you forget because you get to make little stars and it feels cool afterwards. But your money's going. And there's all kinds of ways through new technologies around micropayment that more and more of our money will leave us. So where Visa, did this whole campaign, think of it as money. Here's a giant gold coin and a giant gold money clip. It's money. Most of us don't even know what Braintree is, right? Anybody know what Braintree is? That does what? When? What services is it?
It helps merchants integrate into existing payment services, simplify it for them.
Well, so Braintree is the thing that's in most of these kind of ambient payment services. So Lyft and Uber use Braintree, which is now PayPal, I guess, or owned by PayPal. So this kind of backgrounded payment. Amazon has developed its own separate thing to do exactly the same business, but it's this kind of, payment when I'm not aware of it thing. So there's not going to be any ad, right, saying think of it as money. It's going to be like, nothing's happening here. Then, on the agenda too, we are seeing, machine learning being used to come up with all kinds of alternative ways of making credit decisions and doing risk scoring. I think this is actually fascinating, and this is the kind of thing that is, just like mobile money, there are ambivalences here. On the one hand, this could be really, really, really great and huge. On the other hand, we've already seen in some instances this just recreating redlining, but based on other forms of data. And I don't mean redlining for mortgages, I mean it in the more kind of broader philosophical sense. But then the anthropologist in me says, okay, even if it is recreating a kind of redlining, how are people going to use it anyway? Because they probably are, right? They probably are going to use it to manage, reframe, remake identity in the moments where they have access to new kinds of credit because of the new kinds of data that are being leveraged and new kinds of scores that are being allocated to them to give them access to that. People are going to find a way, right? Anthropologists always say things like human's going to human. You just have to kind of see how it'll turn out. I mentioned that there are things to talk about still with the legacy players. A lot of the game is still about going after those legacy players. A lot of the blockchain stuff is about this too, not just with these consumer-facing ones, but but back-end processing for securities clearance and settlement, or the clearinghouse, or things that we don't normally think about. Be interesting to see what happens there. On the retail side, P2P is still really hard. If you don't live in a world with M-Pesa, or a very similar, even if you do live in a world of M-Pesa, it's still pretty hard for me to send money to you without just handing you over cash. Even though, as I said, we have lots, or as it says here, we have lots of ways of faking it, right? So if I send you money by PayPal, even if it looks like it's coming to you instantly, it's not. PayPal is sort of dealing with it on the back end, and it's still settling at T+1 or T+2. There's a typo there. It should not say 2017, but another thing I didn't mention is one of the reasons for this Cambrian explosion in payment was there was a ton of interest because the market wasn't going anywhere, right? Nobody had places to put their money. Payment was heating up. It was a place to put your money to see some returns. The market maybe is back, question mark? So anyway, sort of what now? What's going to happen now that we've seen so many payment startup failures? Is there still going to be the VC money going there? You can look at nice charts that show VC money and payment going like this, as VC money and AI and ML goes like that, but we'll see. There's still these two twinned dreams, right? The dreams of disintermediating the old guys and dreams of leveraging the data. And there is also still very much this sort of war on cash. And again, I'm not pro-cash or anti-cash. I'm just cash is, and cash will be. So we should sort of think about what that means and how we do digital financial services with cash, alongside cash. We have seen in almost every single instance in all the research projects that we funded around the world, when people get introduced to a new digital payment system or financial service, one thing is not replacing another. It's being sort of put into the mix of technologies that people have available and being used for different things. And I could ask every single one of you, what do you use your debit card for? What do you use Venmo for? What do you use PayPal for? What do you use your credit card for? If you ever use a check, what's it for? And you're going to tell me different things for each one of those technologies. There's no reason to expect that's going to be different anywhere where DFS is being rolled out. I like the payment scholar in the public intellectual Brett Scott, who has this nice piece on the war on cash, where he says, and he's extremely critical, he says cashless society is a euphemism for the ask your banks for permission to pay society. Rather than an exchange occurring directly between the hotel and me, for example, it takes the form of a have your people talk to my people affair. Again, I worry about new forms of exclusion. I'm interested, excited by some of the new business opportunities at the same time created by machine learning and AI. And I'm reminded always of this, which is Joan Robinson, the Cambridge economist from the early 20th century. But she was quoted at me by a mobile money intellectual in 2009. Right? I was like, what if this is going to cause new kinds of exclusion? She's like, worse than being excluded by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being excluded at all. Part of me is starting to love FICO as I worry about alternative risk scoring, right? It's like, FICO is kind of great. It's pretty rational. Part of me is now wanting to jump up and down and cheer the central banks for ensuring a right to choice in payment. And in the Fed, this is part of their mandate. We always think of the Fed in terms of banking, not in terms of payment, but payment is a huge part of the Fed's mandate. And that mandate is to ensure a right to choices in payment, including a par choice, which means a free choice, which means a public option, right? We don't think about a public option for payment, right? We have to think about a public option for payment, just like we should be thinking about a public option in healthcare, or we should be thinking about net neutrality. This gets me in trouble in social science circles, because when I talk about things like the extent to which the payments industry, including the new entrants, are all based on fees and tolls, I say things sometimes like, wouldn't it be nice if the market mechanism worked actually? And the sort of critical Marxists are like, rah, you're a neoliberal. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but maybe in this industry we could use a little bit more of that, not less. maybe if there were more market discipline in what has been essentially a rent-seeking sector, we'd have more efficiencies and maybe actually serve people a little bit better. Wechat Pay, seeing this in action and being with friends in China, really, I came home a little bit more of a libertarian. So there is stuff here around thinking about surveillance and control that DFS permits and the kind of digital civil rights that we might need to be talking about as we roll these things out. Just to give you an apocryphal story, has anyone ever used it before or have it on their phone? Yeah, so you know how it's like there's a whole bunch of things you can do within it. You can like, shop and like order food and get a taxi, and like there's like a, get like fashion advice, and you can like chat with your friends and stuff. You can get news, and you can unlock a bike, right? With the sort of, what is it, OFO is one of the bike share services. I had more than one person tell me, yeah, you just never know. When you go to unlock a bike, sometimes it doesn't work. And you just never know if it's not working because they've been listening in on your conversations or because it's just broken or the network is down, right? And like already there's this kind of idea that the total surveillance that this, in theory, allows could make rule and control very gentle indeed, right? No need to go shut down the protest if nobody can actually get there. There's a sense in which some of the things that we're talking about are creating closed loops, to use payments industry terminology, and expensive private gateways for payment. These have real world consequences for mobility, not just economic mobility, but actual getting around mobility. This is just off the Irvine campus, right? No cash on the 73. And to me, really drives home the need to be thinking about how, if we're building infrastructures, we always need to be thinking about the public good they serve, if not the necessity of at least some of them being public infrastructures, not private ones. As I said, I was in a telescope in and out, and that's what I've done. Thank you very much for your time. Check out IMTFI. You'll see all of our research there. And there's some collateral up here if you're interested. And I'd be pleased to take your questions, or we can just go drink outside.
Let's take a few questions.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
This was fantastic.
At a level, you just like blew my mind. I like going through a whole bunch of things.
At one level, but on another level, what?
The question I have is whether the move to data as a currency away from the tolls is a fundamental maturing of the market, or if it's that these other markets are just have less players that are less competitive and will remain as such.
This is a perfect question. I don't think we can answer that yet. I think that's why I say, like, watch the legacy players and see what they do. And I think we are seeing them do more and more and more with data and less with fees. So one thing happened, and I always talk about sort of the 3 Ds. I didn't put this slide in there, but the 3 Ds are basically data, debit, well, sorry, in order. Debit, Durbin, and data, right? And that's about sort of the changing business models in the payments industry. Debit is just after the financial crisis in sort of the global north, tons of people stopped using credit cards and started using debit cards. Once they started doing that, the rent scheme for payments kind of just dwindled because the interchange on debit is lower than on credit, okay? That's debit. Durbin is the Durbin Amendment, to which I don't even know if it exists anymore because they're like in the middle of repealing all of the post-financial crisis legislation. But the Durbin Amendment further reduced interchange on debit to virtually nothing, right? Making it much more like par clearance. The banks hated it. It's probably going to come back, but for a while that really was pushing them into other streams of revenue that would be based on things like data. Debit, data, Durbin, that's it, yeah. So we kind of have to see. I mean, where we are now in terms of regulation here, everything's up for grabs. So, I mean, we're certainly seeing a return to, rent seeking more broadly, not just in payments, but as kind of a thing that's okay to do now again. But the real question is, are folks going to arrive at something to do with this data that serves some kind of consumer need that like folks actually want and grab onto and do something with? So like, I referenced the credit union example earlier, right? This is one example of an industry kind of struggling with what do we do to maintain our brand identity and keep our members as members, not customers, right? If you have a credit union, you're a member, you're not a client, you're not a customer, you belong. How do we keep doing that in the world of algorithmic kind of processes? So I think it's the jury's out there. We speaking as the kind of anthropologist you can talk from 10,000 years of human history, right? We haven't ever really had like actual kind of free ungoverned markets where the market mechanism does its thing. It's always been on a platform of governance for governance and patronage and clientage and all that. So at that kind of level, does this kind of shift toward data tend toward a more market-like thing? It might, but then it's still going to be kind of a level of degree, not like a switch or a sea change. It's fascinating to me how many of the startups in the space really don't know what they want to do with that data. They just want to get it. That's really interesting, right? It's still the oil or whatever, sorry, I thought you had a question, but you were crouching to take a picture or something. Okay. Another payments industry person said to me once, and I repeat this often in talks and in some of my publications. They said, look at like what cashlessness is all about is, and he said, cash payments at the point of sale is the last commons. Okay, like does that process all that? So cash payment at the point of sale is a last commons. It's not enclosed. Nobody owns the data in that transaction. If I go to a point of sale and give you cash and then go away, you don't know anything about me. I don't have, you don't have anything about me. I don't have anything about you. The cash itself kind of, if that were all digitized, right, then there could be some ownership and you could do something with that data. And he referred to it as a commons, right? And those of you who know your history know that the commons was the kind of common land held by the peasantry in feudal society that then got enclosed by lords who were becoming petty capitalists, kicking the peasants off their land to grow sheep to feed the industrial mills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was just kind of fascinating to have someone say this to me. People, because I'm an anthropologist, I actually think that like without doing anything, I just elicit these things automatically. It's like, oh yeah, anthropology. The commons, I read about that in the anthropology class. Or, you must know about Marcel Mauss. This is a lot like a gift economy. So anyway, other questions? Yeah.
Comments and questions. So really interesting conversation there, right? So, like, is the market maturing, and that now are we now moving from keys to actually data and road? And so, like, in my mind thinking about it, so earlier it was the keys, that was the revenue model, and then maybe the data, you could probably, if you can actually manage to sell things to people, and so that's probably a better revenue model. And so it would maybe, if you assume that people will keep shopping and spending the same amount of time, same amount of money, then then this you can see this as a race through data to gain monopoly that people will just buy one thing and so that's very interesting.
To then create another enclosure, but it's a different one. It's not a payment enclosure. It's a kind of retail or enclosure. So I'm only buying stuff from Amazon or whatever. Yeah.
And so my question was around your comment about that, one payment modality doesn't replace another, right? So, which is very different than, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but can you expand on that actually? Like, if I have like $20 and then I tomorrow, instead of using those at the shop of the debit card, right? So I'm using a different payment modality. So from my perspective, I have replaced cash with a credit card. And so are there different perspectives when you actually say that? Or?
I mean, there may be some kind of individual people for whom things are replacing other things and they're stopping using X. But when we look kind of at economies as a whole, no. And especially not with regard to cash, because of there's so many, unless you're in a country with very low income inequality, with kind of homogeneity, generally speaking, built out electronic infrastructures that generally have a government mandate behind them, like Sweden, it just doesn't seem to happen. And then even in places like Sweden, you're still going to find coins in a fountain, right? I mean, you're still going to find the kinds of other practices that people use cash for. And also you're going to find interesting practices that people are using different kinds of digital for as well, right? It's not, I don't want to suggest that, for instance, cash equals old rituals, right? Because some old rituals people are doing with mobile now too, all kinds of things. there's great examples in, the Muslim world of doing stuff around sadaqah, like not obligatory. Well, there's also zakat things too, but there's sadaqah things, like little tiny alms that you can give that there's little apps for. So anyway, yeah. Is it?
So I'm interested in trying to clarify the misery of being excluded by capitalists like others. And like as a lot of CFS researchers and practitioners, how do you decide that ethics? Like what is what sort of processes do we go through in having discussions around?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. So what I do is like what I kind of just did and just kind of make the case that, we all understand net neutrality and a public option in healthcare. There should be a public option in payment. I mean, that's kind of like a quick and dirty rhetorical move to kind of get out of the ethics of all of that. The other thing that we've done at IMTFI, and sometimes this kind of raised hackles, is we would just sort of distill out of the research lessons learned that sometimes, weren't the lessons people wanted to hear. Like an example is people want to do bad stuff, and you're not going to make them stop doing bad stuff, right? I mean, it's really hard to build something that channels people always to do what you think you want them to do. Behavior is really hard to change. There's all sorts of little nudges you can do around, say, a digital platform that makes you only, you can be really oppressive about it. And like, it'll only work at these sorts of places. You could do that. But then what people are going to do for their bad stuff is use another modality of payment to do it. On the broader kind of exploitation question, I kind of think that Joan Robinson was right? So the kind of abjection of being no longer of any value to, I'm being videoed, but I might as well, the capitalist maw, is pretty terrible, right? Then it's just sort of, there is no value to be extracted from you, you are below human. So how, given that, can we still find modes of what we conventionally call empowerment? One answer is to think about the ways that people are using some of these payment systems and other forms of money to build alternative economies, right? So for instance, you can think about alternative economy in a small scale sort of way, like the Raska experiment yesterday when in this board game that we played that IMTFI developed, but I'll come to in a second, amazing amount of collective communalism just sort of bubbled up, except for from Sam. And it all was kind of beautiful until the very end when they had to decide who was the winner. And then all kinds of shenanigans happened. So from small scale to the kinds of experiments that are happening around the world with sort of, solidary economy movements. All around us, there are alternative economic experiments taking place all the time. And for me, kind of politically and ethically, the question is to see if we can sort of dilate those. Right? I mean, make them just a little bigger to encompass more so that they're all there. Yeah.
I think you already touched on this, but I'll still ask a different version of it. We talked about fees-based or data-based, but there's a public goods-based approach as well. So I'm assuming you're not putting that with the fees-based. So what are your thoughts on public goods or utility-based payment system, and when is something okay to become a utility or public?
I mean, so it's really hard. It's really hard to take something that starts out as a private good and turn it into a public good. That's a gigantic political battle. But yeah.
UBI,
Yep.
If that was not there, I would not have asked.
No. It's a great example. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that this is actually a key political question of our time, not just in payments, but across the board, right? I mean, it gets into these sort of political theory things about what are governments for, and if are governments to provide for a common level of I don't want to say basic income or whatever, but like something like that, a common level of survival for its citizens and those who live within its territory, right, to whom it owes something for their being there and contributing to it and blah, blah, blah. It's a huge, I mean, that's like the issue of our day, right? I mean, like Google, et cetera. Like, at what point does it need to be a utility? Does it need to be regulated as such? In the kind of era that we're in, and again, not just now post-election, but, since the financial crisis, if not before, it's really hard to make a case for public goods. But the crisis did kind of bring out that rhetoric again. So that's something interesting to think about and a hopeful point, at least for me. For us, I mean, just to give you a sense of the research agenda, we're currently working on a project on cash as a public good, right? And not just, I mean, it's not like to be like better than cash, lions, shut up and sit down. It's not that. It's just like that's great, but don't forget this, that there are these things that it does. There is a public good that it serves for certain communities, for certain kinds of transactions, for certain kinds of social relations, and for a relationship between people and a government that's important, unless we want, to be anarchists. Sorry, I was going to tell you another story, but I will save it for wine. Yeah.
One of the use cases you mentioned that is still difficult is international events.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering what you think, what changes we may see in international events as a forward change, or what changes you would like to see.
So that's a tough nut to crack. So I'm not like much of a blockchain booster, but like in theory, you should be able to do something with blockchain to solve that problem. If you could also solve all the other problems with blockchain around energy consumption and all that, right? Like in theory, that should be a thing that would work. The other thing that it's important not to forget with existing remittance providers. So people get into the remittance space and they're like, we're going to solve it. And then they don't look at like who's already solved it in a way. Like you should look at Western Union, right? What does Western Union do? It does not just send money, right? Its business is love. All of its marketing stuff is around love, is around family, is around connection. Western Union holds seminars to teach you how to get your work permit if you're like in the Philippines and you're going to go work in Dubai, right? I mean, all that stuff then stitches together these things that are so tightly interwoven, even though we're not supposed to think that way, which is love, family, and money. Well, I guess love and family we're supposed to think of as together, but we're not supposed to think of them as with money, right? I mean, that's like so taboo. Like, how much do you love me? Well, about like $1.50 right now. That's not okay. Or actually, I kind of love you, Mom, a little bit more than Dad, like maybe like $100 more, right? But Western Union does it, and not in a crass term, but exploits that so well. And if you're going to do an international remittance service, you have to realize that you're not just in the business of me sending money to you, but me sending money to you because of a relationship. And I think that this sort of relationship stuff like just falls out of the picture all the time. People just always forget it. And relationships don't have to be like love. They don't have to be that kind of relationship, by the way. Just footnote. Like relationships can be like relationships of hierarchy or rank, but they can be super important to people and how they manage their lives. One of the really interesting contrasts that we've seen, but we haven't really dug into in some of the stuff that's come out of IMTFI. And you have to understand with all this work, there's like a mountain of material, and there's all these people who have all their data, and we're still kind of thinking about what we've got. It's almost all qualitative data, so it takes forever. Is these sort of interesting contrasts between places where we have people who are used to societies where there's a kind of system of equal bride wealth, where there are like my 13th cow, there are these sort of marriage payments that go back and forth and that extend over time over different parts of the life course, but it all kind of balances out. And people in societies where there are kind of hierarchies of rank, where folks are just born into different stations. And people at the top might owe things to people down the chain, and vice versa. People down the chain might have to make payments to people up the chain. So in some communities in Ghana, for instance, you have people say things like, mobile money's not for me, it's only for rich people, right? But then you dig a little deeper and they're not actually saying rich people, they're saying people up there, right? People up higher than me in the hierarchy. But that's meaningful too, right? I mean, that's a kind of relationship that, again, brings together money and obligation differently from the way that you see it in the 13th cow in a kind of bride wealth society. So again, relationships don't have to just be like, I love you. It can be, ooh, I owe you, But the owing creates an enduring tie that often becomes the sort of thing that keeps people alive when times are tough. early on, we had people telling us, mobile money will bring equality the way that, wait for it, money itself brought equality. And the way that money itself brought equality, in case you were wondering, is money itself, modern capitalist Western money, meant that anybody could anonymously transact with anybody else, right? I could have been a serf and you could have been a lord. I could be a person of low birth, you can be a person of high birth. But in the marketplace with modern capitalist money, it's just green, the end, done, boom. Right, that kind of freedom. But what we forget, if you know your George Simmel, right, what we forget is the other side of Simmel's story is that it liberates you, but then that liberation means you're on your own, right? You're free, but you're also free to fail and free to fall and free to die. So anyhow, other questions, or should we
So I think
whine?
Break.
Okay.
I think this has been absolutely fantastic. I want to thank you.
Thank you all. Yep. Thank you.